definitions, I guess is what I would say, right? Of who is the bribe payer and who is the bribe taker. One of the things I wanted to point out that I may not have pointed out as clearly as I should have is that there are many statutes against taking bribes that focus on government officials that take the bribes, including our own. And in fact, we have a congressperson right now, congressman. Have any of you heard of Matt Gaetz? I think his name is pronounced, right? And he has been alleged, he's being investigated for involvement with a 17-year-old female and, quote, taking her across state lines on business trips with him. But it also turns out, as one investigation leads to another, that he may have taken bribes. So that's a current case where he would be in violation of not this statute, but the statute that eliminates bribe taking by government officials. All right, so I wanted to be sure I pointed that out. Very importantly, this, I should go back to this one. Remember that this becomes a monopoly, right? The briber becomes a monopoly seller. So they don't have to compete on the quality of product or merit. They don't have to compete on price. They become a monopoly not by producing the best quality product at the most reasonable cost, but by paying a bribe to a government official. All right. So we, of course, back in the 70s, we being the United States, adopted a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because we had a lot of the industrialized corporations that were paying bribes all over the world coming from our country. And I think I mentioned Lockheed being one. And so, but there were others, right? We were trying to get contracts to build military craft for various countries. I think I used the example with Lockheed of Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So we, were known as beating out other competitors on the basis of paying bribes. So then, of course, we adopted a federal statute with criminal and civil penalties, and that, which we'll go over in just a moment, and which you are responsible for. Remember that the bribe has to be knowingly or corruptly made, which is usually, right, it can be that circumstantial evidence of intent can be through emails, can be through testimony of others that knew you were carrying suitcases of cash across borders, as Siemens was back in the early 2000s. So you still have to prove intent for any criminal penalty, always mental intent. But those are the kinds of circumstantial evidence that support intent of knowingly or corruptly. All right, which we've talked about before in regards to just criminal conduct generally. Okay, now we know that also, right, you can't just have that line item on your expenses, bribery 1.7 billion. And so as a consequence, you have to hide all this transaction. Now, Siemens claims, as you'll see, we have a slide later on, that they didn't know. And I mean, how rich are you when $1.7 billion of expense goes missing and you don't know? I don't know. I think pretty rich, right? So to get some additional enforcement effort behind this reduction of bribery in international business transactions, the accounting provisions also were adopted. So this is really part of the Securities and Exchange Act because of the accounting provisions. And remember that, right, this requires reasonable assurances that the financial statements be accurate and truthful, and that there are internal control systems. I checked on the penalties, and they are definitely, this is the latest with them. They do increase over time. Individual criminal penalties, 5 years in prison or $250,000 fine. Now notice, right, that under corporate criminal penalties, this is just the criminal penalties, not the civil penalties, there's $2 million. And you may say, well, then how do they end up spending $2.6 billion in settlement? A couple of things. Number one, $2 million fine per violation that can be proved, right? So, you know, when they were carrying suitcases of cash across borders, how many times did that happen? How many companies did they pay that money to, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how it adds up into much bigger amounts. Once again, with Siemens, as we saw with Google, are we too big to fail? Then under the alternative fines provision here, we see that there are ways, oh, sorry, you guys. There are ways of being fined up to an amount of twice, and here's what it says. I love legal terms because we could just make it simple, but the statute says gross pecuniary gain, meaning how twice as much money as they gained. And so statistical experts, financial accounting experts, and so forth would come in and testify. How much money did they gain from paying these bribes? And so in some instances, if that can be proved, that can be an alternative fine provision. Now notice, because of the scandals, right, with Enron and then with the mortgage crisis and so forth going on, the accounting fraud has much higher penalties if that can be proved. So you do not want to be the person filling out the financial statements that are fraudulent about the bribes. 20 years of prison, right? This is part of Sarbanes-Oxley, and a corporate criminal fine up to 25 million, just for the accounting part. And so that's another way that we see the settlements and or criminal penalties assessed increase to such large amount. Now, in 1998, can you all see this? Yes, okay. In 1998, we had to amend, which means make changes in our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so we called it the International Anti-Bribery and Fair Competition Act. Now notice the word fair competition has been added because of its impact on two areas of law: the corruption of public officials by paying bribes, and also the corruption of the competition laws of most of the countries in which this was occurring. So this particular amendment of 1998 expanded the definition of what was a public official to include the World Bank and the IMF. I need to add IMF to that. I'll do that. Who are the entities making